It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the air felt still, heavy with unsaid words. I hadn't expected to see Lydia there, at least not so soon. She usually went to the café on Sundays, always at the same time, sipping on her black coffee, while gazing out the window with that faraway look she often had. But today, as I ordered my usual, I saw her seated in the corner by the window, alone. She looked up when I entered, her eyes catching mine for just a brief moment, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of surprise, maybe even recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual warm, gentle smile. A smile that somehow always managed to make me feel like I was seeing her for the first time, every time. "Hey Lydia," I said, trying to sound casual as I walked over to her table. "Mind if I join you?" She looked at me with those deep, thoughtful eyes of hers, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Of course not, Alex. Please have a seat." I took the chair across from her, feeling a strange, almost electric energy in the air between us. Lydia had always had this effect on me, an inexplicable pull that made it hard to look away, hard to focus on anything but her when she was near. Maybe it was her voice, soft and calm, with a depth that hinted at experiences, emotions, and secrets she kept carefully hidden. Or perhaps it was her presence, the way she seemed to be both fully there and somewhere else entirely lost in her own thoughts. So I began, breaking the silence. "Didn't expect to see you here on a Thursday." She shrugged, stirring her coffee slowly, her eyes focused on the swirling liquid. "I needed a change of scenery, I guess. Sometimes the routine can feel confining." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words resonate in my own life. "I get that," I replied, my voice quieter now. "Sometimes it's like you're trapped, just going through the motions without really being." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Exactly," she said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "Sometimes you just need to break free." For a moment we sat in silence, letting the weight of those words linger in the space between us. I could feel something shifting, something unspoken passing between us, a shared understanding, a mutual recognition of the loneliness we both felt but rarely expressed. "So what are you running from?" she asked suddenly, her tone light but her gaze serious. I chuckled, trying to deflect the question. "I could ask you the same thing." She raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair, studying me with a curiosity that felt both inviting and intimidating. "Maybe we're both running from the same thing," she murmured, more to herself than to me. The conversation shifted, turning to safer, lighter topics, the latest movie she'd watched, the new books she'd ordered. But even as we talked, I could feel that undercurrent of tension simmering beneath the surface, an unspoken awareness that neither of us dared to address directly. It was in the way she laughed a little too softly, the way her hand brushed against mine as she reached for her coffee, lingering just a moment too long. Every touch, every glance felt charged, filled with an intensity that left me both exhilarated and uneasy. At one point she looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leaving?" I repeated, surprised by the question. She nodded, her eyes still on her coffee. "Just ... getting away. Starting fresh somewhere new, somewhere where no one knows you, where you can be anyone you want." Her words struck a chord in me, stirring something I'd buried a long time ago. I admitted. "But I don't know. It feels like running, doesn't it? Like you're just avoiding something you'll eventually have to face." She looked up, her gaze piercing. "Maybe. Or maybe it's about finding something you didn't know you needed." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken questions, unacknowledged emotions. I felt my heart beating faster, my pulse quickening as I watched her, captivated by the vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet strength beneath her soft exterior. "Lydia," I said softly, almost hesitantly, "what are you looking for?" She didn't answer right away, her eyes drifting back to her coffee. Then, slowly, she looked up, her gaze meeting mine with a raw, almost painful honesty. "I don't know, Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe ... maybe I'm just looking for something real, something that makes me feel alive." I didn't know what to say. Her words hung in the air, filling the space between us with a weight that felt almost unbearable. I could feel my own heart echoing her words, her longing, her desire for something more than the life we both seemed to be drifting through. Without thinking, I reached across the table, my hand covering hers. Her skin was warm, soft, and as our hands touched, I felt a spark, a jolt that traveled through me, igniting something deep within. She looked down at our hands, her breath catching, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, her fingers intertwining with mine, holding on as if she'd found something she hadn't known she was looking for. The cafe felt distant now, the sounds of clinking dishes and murmured conversations fading into the background. All I could focus on was the warmth of her hand in mine, the way her fingers fit perfectly between my own, the subtle, almost imperceptible movement of her thumb as it brushed against my skin. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This isn't right." I swallowed, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in my chest. "I know," I replied, my voice just as soft, "but it feels real," she finished, her eyes searching mine. I nodded, my gaze never leaving hers. "Yeah, it does." For a moment we stayed like that, our hands intertwined, our eyes locked in a silent exchange that said more than any words ever could. I could feel my heart racing, my pulse pounding in my ears, and I knew that I was crossing a line, stepping into dangerous, uncharted territory. But I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Not yet. "Maybe maybe just this once," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Maybe we don't have to worry about what's right." Her words hung in the air, suspended between us like a fragile promise. I could feel the tension building, the anticipation growing as we both leaned in, drawn to each other by an invisible force that neither of us could resist. I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the hesitation mingling with the desire, and I knew that she was just as scared, just as conflicted as I was. But as our faces drew closer, as the space between us dwindled to nothing, I realized that none of that mattered. Not here, not now. All that mattered was this moment, this connection, this feeling that made everything else fade away. Her lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, a whisper of a kiss that left me breathless. I felt her hand tighten around mine, her fingers pressing into my skin as she leaned in, her lips capturing mine with a gentleness that belied the intensity of the emotions swirling between us. It was a kiss filled with years of longing, of unsaid words, of buried desires finally set free. For a moment we were lost in each other, our hearts beating in sync, our breaths mingling as we gave in to the attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. I could feel the warmth of her body, the softness of her lips, the way her fingers clung to mine as if afraid to let go. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the guilt, not the fear, only the two of us alone in our own little world. Her lips lingered on mine, hesitant yet unyielding, like she was savoring a taste she'd longed for, but never allowed herself to have. As we broke apart, her gaze remained steady, though I could see a storm of emotions flashing behind her eyes: desire, confusion, fear, and something deeper, something she was afraid to acknowledge. "Alex," she whispered, her voice almost pleading, we can't do this." I felt a pang of guilt, an awareness of the line we were crossing, yet the warmth of her hand in mine, the softness of her breath, so close to my face, it all made it hard to think clearly, to remember why we shouldn't. "I know," I replied, my voice barely audible, but I don't want to let go." Her eyes softened, a look of resignation mixed with longing crossing her face. She released a small sigh, and it felt as though she was surrendering, letting go of whatever invisible wall she'd put up between us. Her fingers tightened around mine and she looked down, her eyelashes casting delicate shadows on her cheeks. "Maybe it's been too long since I felt like this," she murmured, almost to herself. "Too long since anything felt this real." I didn't know what to say. Her vulnerability, her openness was something I hadn't seen before, a glimpse of the part of her that she usually kept hidden, guarded. I wanted to say something to comfort her, to tell her that whatever she was feeling, she didn't have to hide it, not with me. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned in, letting my forehead rest gently against hers. We sat like that, close and silent, feeling the weight of each other's presence, the quiet intensity of the moment wrapping around us like a cocoon. The noise of the café faded even further, until it was as if we were the only two people in the world. Lydia's hand slipped free of mine, only to find its way to my cheek, her fingers tracing a line down to my jaw. Her touch was light, almost hesitant, but there was a certainty in her gaze that hadn't been there before, a determination that seemed to silence the doubts flickering in her eyes. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I shouldn't want this, but I do." Her confession was like a key unlocking something deep within me, something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her. I reached up, covering her hand with mine, my thumb brushing over her knuckles in a silent reassurance. "We don't have to make this complicated," I said softly, though the words felt like a lie even as I spoke them. "Just stay here, with me, just for now." She closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping as if releasing a weight she'd been carrying for years. "Just for now," she echoed, her voice a fragile promise. Her hand slipped from my cheek, but before I could fully register the loss, she stood, her fingers trailing down my arm until they reached my hand. She looked at me, her eyes filled with an unspoken question, and I knew what she was asking, what we both wanted but were too afraid to say. Without a word, I stood and followed her out of the café, the cool afternoon air hitting us like a wave, refreshing and grounding. She led me around the corner to a quiet alley, out of sight from the bustling streets, and turned to face me, her expression a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us, my hand finding hers once again, our fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd always belonged that way. For a moment we just stood there, close but not quite touching, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. The silence was thick with tension, with the weight of everything we weren't saying, everything we were feeling. Then, slowly, I raised my free hand to her face, my thumb brushing over her cheek, her skin soft and warm beneath my touch. She closed her eyes, leaning into my hand, her lips parting slightly as if waiting for me to close the gap. When I finally did, it was like coming home. Her lips were soft, warm, and she kissed me back with a tenderness that stole my breath, a gentleness that belied the passion simmering just beneath the surface. Her hands found their way to my shoulders, holding on to me as if she was afraid to let go, as if I were the only thing keeping her grounded. Every kiss, every brush of her fingers against my skin felt like a silent confession, a release of all the emotions we'd been holding back for so long. I could feel her heartbeat against my chest, quick and unsteady, matching the rhythm of my own racing pulse. It was intoxicating, the way she melted into me, the way her body pressed against mine, filling every empty space, every lonely corner I hadn't realized was there. "Alex," she breathed, her voice muffled against my lips. I don't want this to end." "Neither do I replied, my voice rough with emotion. "But I don't know what happens next." She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought I saw a flash of fear, of uncertainty. But then she smiled, a small, sad smile that tugged at something deep inside me. Maybe we don't have to know," she whispered, her fingers tracing a line down my arm. "Maybe we can just be, just for a little while." Her words were like a balm, soothing the doubts gnawing at the edges of my mind. I nodded, pulling her close, feeling the warmth of her body against mine, the steady rise and fall of her breathing as she leaned her head against my shoulder. We stood there, holding each other, finding comfort in the silence, in the closeness, in the quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was something we both needed, something that made us feel alive in a way neither of us had felt in a long time. As the minutes passed, the world around us slowly came back into focus, the distant hum of traffic, the muffled voices of passers-by, the faint smell of coffee lingering on her sweater. But even as reality seeped back in, I couldn't bring myself to let go. Not yet, not when everything in me was screaming to hold on, to keep her close, to savor this fleeting, forbidden moment just a little longer. "Lydia," I murmured, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know where this leads, but..." She looked up at me, her eyes soft, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe we don't need to know, maybe it's enough to just feel." Her words were simple, yet they struck a chord deep within me, resonating with the part of me that had always longed for something real, something true. I leaned down, pressing my forehead against hers, letting the warmth of her skin, the softness of her breath, seep into me. For a long time we stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the world around us fading into a blur. I could feel the tension between us building, a quiet intensity simmering just beneath the surface, growing stronger with every shared breath, every soft touch. It was as if we were both standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, held back only by the fragile threads of restraint that neither of us seemed willing to sever completely. Then, almost reluctantly, she pulled back, her fingers lingering on my arms as she looked up at me, her gaze filled with a sadness that twisted my heart. "We should go," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. I nodded, though the thought of leaving, of letting go, felt like a weight settling in my chest. "Yeah, we probably should." But neither of us moved, our bodies still close, our fingers still intertwined. It was as if leaving this moment meant losing something irreplaceable, something we might never find again. As we stood there, frozen in the quiet alley with our hands still entwined, a part of me knew that we were on the verge of something irreversible. Lydia's eyes held mine, searching as if she were seeking permission, as if she wanted to be convinced. I felt my pulse quicken, and a warmth surged within me, dissolving any hesitation I might have had. Without another word, I pulled her closer, feeling the softness of her body against mine, the familiar scent of her perfume mingling with the cool evening air. She didn't resist. Instead, her fingers tightened around mine, her breathing growing shallow as I leaned in, brushing my lips against her forehead. Her skin was warm, and as I trailed gentle kisses along her temple, down to her cheek, I felt her relax into me, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. She tilted her face toward mine, and our eyes met, an unspoken agreement passing between us, a final surrender. Our lips met again, this time with an urgency, a rawness that neither of us tried to temper. Lydia's hand slid up my chest, resting against my shoulders as she pressed closer, her kiss deepening, filling the empty spaces that I'd kept hidden, even from myself. Her fingers tangled in my hair, and I could feel her trembling slightly, a subtle vulnerability that only made me want to hold her tighter, to shield her from whatever doubts lingered in her mind. As our kiss grew more passionate, I lost track of time, of place, of everything but her. Each touch, each breath shared between us became an affirmation, a reassurance that this moment was real. She leaned back against the wall, pulling me with her, and I felt her fingers trace the line of my jaw, lingering as if to memorize every detail. "Alex," she whispered, her voice a soft plea, filled with both longing and apprehension. "Lydia," I replied, my own voice breaking. "Tell me to stop if you want me to." But she shook her head, her fingers sliding down my neck to rest against my chest. "I don't want you to stop," she said softly, a hint of desperation in her tone. "I don't think I could bear it." With that, she pulled me closer, our bodies molding together as we kissed, each touch, each caress carrying a depth of emotion that words could never convey. I felt her hands grip my shirt, tugging me closer as if she feared I would disappear. Her lips moved with a fierce tenderness, a silent confession that spoke of everything she couldn't say aloud. Time seemed to stretch, each moment filled with a mix of yearning and quiet despair, as if we both knew this might be our only chance, a fleeting moment we'd have to carry with us, forever unspoken, forever hidden. As we slowly pulled away, breathless, Lydia's gaze lingered on me, her eyes filled with tears she was trying to keep at bay. She raised her hand, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead, her fingers trembling. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know," I replied, my own heart heavy, "but I don't regret it." She closed her eyes, a small tear slipping down her cheek, and I reached up, gently wiping it away. Her hand found mine, her fingers brushing over my knuckles, lingering as if savoring the feel of my touch one last time. I wanted to tell her everything, to promise her a future, but as I looked into her eyes, I knew that such promises would only add to the heartache. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet gratitude, "for making me feel alive." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, knowing that whatever words I could offer would only cheapen the moment. Instead, I squeezed her hand, holding on as long as I dared, until finally, reluctantly, I let go. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the street beyond, and I could feel the distance growing between us, an inevitable return to reality. She stepped back, her hand slipping from mine, and I felt a hollow ache as I watched her retreat, each step taking her further from me, further from the memory we had just created. As she turned the corner and disappeared from view, I stood there, alone in the quiet alley, the weight of the moment settling heavily in my chest. I knew I would carry this memory with me, tucked away in a corner of my heart, a reminder of a connection that had defied logic, reason, and every boundary we had set for ourselves. For a long while I remained there, feeling the lingering warmth of her touch, the faint echo of her voice in my ears. And though I knew we could never have what we both wanted, I also knew that I would never forget her, never forget the woman who had, for one brief moment, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't known was possible.